Some parts of our life stay hidden, the ones that really shape us the most. This is The Layers We Live, a podcast where we pull back the curtain on reproductive health, mental health, identity, grief, and healing. I'm your host, Dr. Loree Johnson, therapist, trainer, reproductive health advocate, and someone who's lived through more than a few layers myself. And around here, I'd like to say that we get honest and we get human and we talk about the things that matter most, but we don't always get to talk about. Hi, and welcome to The Layers We Live. Today, we're exploring something that shows up in nearly every layer of our lives, and that's boundaries. Whether it's in our families, friendships, work, or healthcare, it can be hard to know when to say no, when to lean in, and how to protect your peace without guilt. Boundaries aren't walls, they're more like invitations to connection with clarity. But for so many of us, especially those of us who are socialized to take care of others or who've lived through trauma, setting and maintaining boundaries can feel a little uncomfortable or sometimes unsafe. So today we're diving into what boundaries are and what they aren't, why they're essential for our well-being, how culture, identity, and lived experience kind of shapes how we set boundaries, and how to navigate the pushback when you're setting boundaries that makes us feel uncomfortable. And to help me explore this topic today is my dear colleague and friend, Dr. Homeyra Faghihi. Homeyra is an empowerment coach who supports women struggling to say no, to set kind and clear boundaries, and confidently ask for what they want. A licensed clinical social worker in California for over 20 years, she also holds certifications as a domestic violence counselor and a narcissistic abuse treatment clinician, along with a doctorate in psychology. And through her coaching practice, Power to the Self Coaching, Homeyra integrates her extensive therapy experience with a compassionate, results-driven approach. And her mission is simple yet profound, and that is to help women rediscover who they are beneath the layers of persistent self-doubt so they can step into their full power with clarity, confidence, and self-trust. So welcome, Homeyra.
Hello, Dr. Loree. So wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me.
I am so excited for you to be here. And before we get into our talk today, I would love to share with both of our audiences a little bit about how we kind of became connected, how we know each other. And so do you want to start off and tell the story?
Yes, we have known each other for now probably around 20 years.
Yes.
Is that, 20 years
so.
Probably.
I think so. Oh
yes,
my gosh.
Because for me, it was 1999 when I started to work at Child and Family Guidance Center, which is where we met.
Yes.
And I used to come to your office quite a bit. I loved your office. So calm, so calm and soothing. So I would visit you often. And aside from being colleagues, we had a good, different special connection, I would say.
Yes.
So we have stayed in touch. We have stayed friends all these years. And I am a huge fan of your work, by the way, if I may say. You do such amazing and valuable work. The service that you provide for your community, for your clients is absolutely so necessary. So thank you for all that you do. It's an honor, truly an honor to be your friend and colleague. And a pleasure to be here.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And the feeling is definitely mutual. And for those of you who don't know Dr. Homeyra, she is such a beautiful spirit. And I remember when I met you, when I started, there's just a calmness that you've always exuded and a warmth that I just made me feel very welcome. I feel so honored that you felt like my space was calm and inviting, because that's definitely how I felt when I, went to your office. And there was just the sights of, just the places where so many important conversations happened, and ways that we supported each other in doing some really, really critical work at that time in our careers. And I think working in community mental health is a very honorable thing to do. It's really hard work. It's very rewarding work. And I think we both learned a lot. I know I learned a lot from you. And it's been really nice to see your career shift over the years as well, and how you've grown. And I remember when you started Power to the Self Coaching, and I remember thinking to myself, like, I knew that you had branched off into some different specialties. And then it's like, wow, you've been really doing a lot over these past 20 years as well. So I'm excited to talk with you a little bit more about your work and what brought you to, really specializing in boundaries. And so I'm wondering if it's possible for you to share a little bit about your background and what led you to this type of work around boundaries in particular.
Sure. Yes. So as you know, Dr. Loree, I was born and raised in Iran, and I experienced my own childhood traumas and losses. So there was some of that. Then right after middle school, we had the revolution. And right after that, we had a war going on. So all of that led to a lot of collective trauma for the Iranians at that time. And then on top of that, I was still 19 when I left Iran and came here to the US, LA, as an immigrant all by myself. I mean, I'm very grateful that I had a place to arrive in, but that was temporary. So being an immigrant who doesn't know the language and doesn't have emotional support, financial support, all of that made my childhood and early adulthood all about survival, really, for the most part. And so boundaries were not even in my consciousness. I didn't know that my focus was to survive, as I mentioned. Yeah. So that wasn't a thing at the time. Now, with my professional life, as you know, we worked in community mental health together. I was there for over 13 years. And then my next job was at a women's clinic for 9 years. I was there in women's clinic. And I noticed that no matter what the subject of discussion, no matter what the family culture of the client, it just didn't matter. Boundaries came up all the time. And I knew that I had worked on myself with my own boundaries over the years. And so I knew that it was possible for women to learn, women with history of trauma, which is, all of us pretty much, some of us more than others, but we all have experienced losses and traumas. And so I knew that it was possible for everybody to learn how to set boundaries. And along the same time that I was in that clinic, I also became, and this came out of the blue, it just really caught me off guard. I was a target of a narcissistic person's rage and wrath for several years during that time, which was very traumatic. It really affected me in ways that only, I would say, people who have been a target of that sort of rage would understand. And so even though at that point when this happened, I was already a therapist, I had already done my inner work, and I was already a certified domestic violence counselor. I knew about power differences and communication. I knew all of that. But even with that, I want to normalize it for people in those situations to know, even with all of that education and background and everything, I handled the boundaries in a wrong way at the beginning. I didn't do it right. I went into engaging in discussions and over-explaining and all of that. Yeah. But because of the initial shock. But then I learned that, no, I need to do this differently. I can do this differently. I have it in me. I can do it. Yeah. And that whole experience inspired me to get out there and get my certificate. So that's how I became a narcissistic abuse treatment clinician, because I wanted to understand myself, this person in this dynamic, and also to help my clients even in a deeper way with, let's say, a deeper way, a more meaningful way with boundaries and self-worth related issues, which are all, they go hand in hand for the most part. Yeah.
They do. And I apologize, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but they definitely do intertwine. And I never knew that about you. And so thank you for sharing. And in some ways, it just reminds me of, sometimes what brings us to this field and the work that we do is this lived experience. And so we tend to, some of us tend to gravitate towards that in our work and what we specialize in, and as a way to kind of, understand the process a little bit more deeply and to understand ourselves. And therefore, it seems like it became a really empowering kind of time for you.
Yes, very painful, but at the end, very empowering. And I don't really talk about this much, which is why you and many others around me did not know about this. Because, again, it's something that you need to process for yourself first before you can actually come out with it. So it took me a while to get here.
Yes, I totally agree. And I'm a big proponent of not really sharing anything until I'm further along in my process. Yes. So I completely respect that and appreciate you sharing that on this platform. And so this kind of leads me to my next question, because I'm curious about just even the name behind your practice now, Power to the Self coaching. So what does Power to the Self mean?
Yes. So originally, This name, Power to the Self, was inspired by Power to the People, because I have so much affection for that phrase, because a lot of times we, especially a child of, revolution and being in an environment where the government was so oppressive, the new government. So we had the first government was a little oppressive, then the next one after the revolution, 100 times more oppressive. So I have, growing up, been very aware of the power that we have as a people that we forget that we have. So Power to the Self is just like Power to the People is about taking our power back from the entities that rule our life on the outside. Power to the Self is about, originally that was the meaning anyway, and still is, about taking the power back from the fears that run the show on the inside. So that was the original meaning behind it. And then over the last couple of years, for me now it has even a deeper meaning, because as I become more aware of and in touch with my spiritual beliefs and practicing my spirituality and staying in that space as much as I can, it has given it a different meaning, because I see the self as the essence that we are all born with, the essence that is pure and worthy and confident. And if you have spiritual beliefs, it's the stuff of God. And so reconnecting with that self is truly where we all need to be, especially during these times. It's so important to be grounded in the self and to get to the self. That is, like you mentioned earlier, is hiding underneath all the self-doubt and anger and shame and guilt and all the other stuff.
No, definitely. And I just hearing how it was kind of related to the phrase power to the people, and thinking about your history and having fled Iran during the revolution, and, and the term power to the people is definitely a revolutionary term. And so in some ways, returning to yourself is a revolutionary act, which I think is a very powerful kind of thing right now in the political climate that we're in as well, and can possibly make, setting boundaries even that much more challenging. But I'm curious, how are you personally defining boundaries right now?
Yes, like you mentioned, Dr. Loree, you mentioned earlier, and I've seen that with my clients a lot, where they mistake boundaries with walls. Boundaries are not walls. And so I came up with this analogy because of the wall analogy. I came up with a screen door as an analogy for boundaries, because just like a screen door, when we can keep the flies and the bugs and insects out that we don't want to come in, but fresh air can come in. I see boundaries like a screen door where we can see what's outside. We allow what we want to come into our space, and we keep what we do not want out. And, just like the screen door analogy, if we see something, if somebody, let's say, is pushing their way through, we have the right to close the door on them. Or God forbid, if they're dangerous, call 911, call for a support system, call somebody for help. But, those are like extreme situations. But for the most part, we kind of see that it's not hiding behind a wall, because it can be very lonely.
Yes.
It's fine to be behind a wall for a little bit. If we just escape an abusive relationship, we need to be by ourselves and process things, and we don't want to deal with people for a little bit. That's understandable, but we definitely do not want to be behind the wall on a regular basis. And long term, it's not healthy, because we are born to connect. We are born to have relationships. We are born to be creative. And it's very hard to be creative when it's just you and the wall in front of you. So we do want to learn about healthy boundaries and how to set them. Absolutely.
Yes, no, definitely. And, I like the idea of it being a screen door and not necessarily a wall, because there's still some delineation between you and other, and at the same time honoring that not everything needs to kind of cross that line, so to speak.
Exactly.
And that's a great kind of example. And I'm not sure how else you might want to kind of share what boundary setting or what a boundary might look like in real life.
In real life, it's about, staying with the mainstream culture, really. So I teach, I have lived most of my life in the U.S., so I'm very aware that I have an Iranian Persian culture and I have the mainstream culture. So I teach from the mainstream culture because I've lived here most of my life. And so the way I see it is about communicating your needs and saying no when it doesn't feel authentic to say yes. And so we say it in a concise and warm and kind way. It doesn't have to be, and a lot of people mistake assertive and aggressive, they think they're the same thing. They're not the same.
Yes. Yes.
And so we want to always be aware that assertive is always respectful and aggressive is not respectful. So to express our needs in a kind of clear way and concise and without going into over explaining and going off in tangent, because that's not helpful. We want to stay on the subject. Does that answer your question? Does that make sense?
No, it does. It does. And I appreciate you mentioning just almost like this biculturality that that surrounds you, and recognizing that you have obviously this Iranian perspective, as I would expect you to, having been born there and lived there for part of your life. And now, yeah, it's like you've been here in the US longer than you've lived there. So you have this lens as well. And hopefully we'll get into talking a little bit more about what it might look like or how that process is for you to, talk from one lens and not the other. But I appreciate you making that distinction, because I know that a lot of people here in our communities are more coming from the United Statesian kind of lens as well. So kind of speaking to that. When we think about the importance of boundaries, just how challenging it can be, but also how necessary it can be at the same time, why should we set them? And, what do you think are the downsides of not setting them?
We really do need to learn, I believe, how to set boundaries, because we want to live an authentic life. We want to be able to have a life that is in alignment with our needs and our values. Of course, a lot of people may be listening, or some people listening would say, I don't even know what my needs are. I don't even know what my values are. And that's true. That's very common. If you have lived or been in an abusive relationship, for example, or if you have had a narcissistic parent, your life is all about taking care of the other person's needs and not your own needs. So it makes total sense if you don't know what your needs are and if you don't know what your values are, because you have lived in alignment with somebody else's needs and values. So I want to name that, because that's an issue that comes up constantly in my conversations with my clients. So the first part is to figure that out, which takes some work. And then we want to live a life that is in alignment with those needs and values. And that's, we forget that we deserve to live a life that is a manifestation of our needs and our values. We forget that we deserve that. And it is important to say no, to ask for what we need, because we want to experience self-respect, because we don't otherwise. And it would also help us with, of course, it's challenging, as you said. It is challenging. It's a process, and it will take some time for us to actually get to a place when we can set limits confidently and without a lot of awkwardness. But, it would help us to eventually reconnect with the self-worth that we were mentioning earlier, the part of us that is worthy and is always there, and so if we don't live a life according to our needs and our values, and by the way, I don't mean that, I have to emphasize this, it's not like it's all about my needs and your needs are equally important. That's what I want to put it in context.
Right. Context is important. Right.
Yes, definitely, because there are times where compromise is necessary and healthy and good, and so we're not talking about that. We're talking about situations where there is a very palpable lack of balance in the relationship, where you give, and that's all you're doing. So it's really important that we recognize that what I'm talking about here is situations where we're very aware that there's a lack of balance in the relationship, where I give. So we need to recognize that my needs and your needs are equally important. It's not just that it's all my needs. No, adult relationships, we know that both parties' needs are important. And both parties' needs need to be attended to the best that we can. Again, sometimes we compromise depending on the situation. And so when we don't set boundaries, when we give, we end up feeling drained and anxious, because we keep taking on all these responsibilities that we really don't want to take on. And we end up feeling angry with ourselves and frustrated with ourselves, because I really wanted to say no, but I didn't know how to say no, or I didn't want to feel guilty, so I didn't say no. And so there's all this frustration toward the self that we would experience. And most importantly, because it's a really unpleasant feeling, and that is resentment. We end up feeling resentful toward the other person. And I don't know if your audience is familiar with the work of Dr. Gabor Mate. If not, I strongly recommend that you look him up because he talks a lot about, that's his area of specialty, trauma treatment.
Yes.
And he talks a lot about how, well, let me go back. Actually, we all know, intuitively, we all have known that our body and our mind are connected. Our physical health and our mental health are connected. So we all know that. But now we know that research has shown it. So it's, there's no doubt.
Right.
And he goes into, Dr. Gabor Mate, he goes into talking about how the research has shown that, especially for women, a lot of times when there's lack of boundaries or there's poor boundaries, that there's a correlation between that and autoimmune disorders.
Mm-hmm.
And he talks about that quite often.
Yes.
And I, as a person who worked in a women's clinic for 9 years, I can tell you that I have also observed with a history of trauma, which kind of goes hand in hand a lot of times with the proper boundaries to set with people. I saw a lot of fibromyalgia and constant migraine headaches and constant nausea and vomiting and autoimmune disorders as well. So these are the potential consequences of not setting boundaries and not paying attention to your own needs that we want to pay attention to, that we want to be aware of.
No, definitely. And I think you bring up a good point, especially about boundaries and not necessarily holding them can lead to resentment. Because I often say, and I remember a dear friend and colleague of ours said this to me early in my training, Jane, boundaries or resentment can be the product of boundaries that weren't held, that we didn't know we needed to hold. And that has really stayed with me, and kind of hearing that really, at that point in my training in community mental health. And that stayed with me even as I think about how I, work with kind of couples or individuals in the reproductive health space too, because when you have people who are on a family building journey and one person really wants to keep going, but the other person, doesn't or has some reservations. And so it's like that negotiation can make it really challenging. And sometimes what I see is the partner that maybe not that they don't want to kind of move forward, that might have a little bit more hesitancy. They can defer to those who want to keep going because they don't want to disappoint or might leave big decisions to the other person because they don't want to disappoint. And that's still also another struggle in terms of really honoring like what one's, kind of perspective or values might be at that time. So what do you think makes it difficult for people to set boundaries?
Yes. And if I may add to what you just said before answering this question, if a relationship is important to us, like the example that you just gave, with partners and in marriage, let's say, or a romantic partnership or a good friend, best friend, if that relationship is important to you, I think it's important that you become aware of resentment and not let it build up, because resentment can easily kill a relationship and we don't want it to build up. So I do want to emphasize how important it is that we address it as soon as we can. Now, what makes it difficult to set boundaries? First of all, the big culture, the collective, that's what society teaches us, is to give, nurture. As women, we're supposed to do that. Then it's our family culture. If you come from a culture that is not a Western culture, then it's even more so where the woman, most likely, I'm not speaking for all cultures, but it's very likely that that's also a thing that can cause problems in terms of setting limits. If you haven't seen your mom or grandma setting limits, then you don't know that that's a possibility. To say no is not in your consciousness because you haven't seen it growing up. Yeah. And also, when I used to run a lot of groups, and I envision going back to them soon, but this came up in our groups all the time when we reviewed healthy versus unhealthy boundaries and healthy versus unhealthy relationships. Anytime we did that in group, almost everybody said, I wish I knew this stuff in high school, and it would have saved me so much heartache and heartbreak and over the years. And unfortunately, that's not something that is taught to us in high school. And so these are some of the reasons we don't set limits. And the other one, whether we're conscious of it or not, is we want to avoid the feeling of guilt and shame. We're not necessarily aware a lot of times of the differences between appropriate guilt, like justified guilt, and guilt that is not justified. So we just think, just because I feel guilty, I must be guilty. And that's where we go. So avoiding guilt that may come up, we say yes. So in our mind, in quotation, it's a win-win situation because this person gets what they want and I get to avoid shame and guilt. So, in quotation again, it's a win-win. And so we keep saying yes. And many times we, like I said, I want to emphasize, we don't even know. Even if we wanted to say no, we don't know how to say no. So we say yes.
Well, and I think you mentioned too, I'm just kind of touching on the, the cultural piece of it too, like what, because I think families are their own culture and not just, kind of our nationality or ethnicity, and you growing up in Eastern culture and then immigrating here to Western. And then also I think about just some of the messaging that, that I think a lot of, Black women get too about what we shoulder and what I watched my mom shoulder and what I watched my grandmother and a lot of other, kind of women in my community shoulder. It became like, this was the model that I had. And it was really more about energy going out instead of thinking about energy coming in. Exactly. And I think that piece around, it being difficult to set boundaries being related to, that guilt or shame and like what comes up when we do set a boundary or what does that mean for the other person and how do we hold that? So I appreciate you mentioning that. And I'm curious, where do you think people tend to struggle most with boundaries, particularly around maybe family, work, romantic relationships, or I'm even wondering about even as they engage in healthcare, and with their healthcare providers? Where do you see the struggle the most?
Yes. Actually, I think that in all these areas that you just mentioned, the most difficult space to set boundaries in is where the other person, we perceive them as higher status, or maybe they do have a higher status, they do have more power, more control in the relationship. That's when it's most difficult and most tricky. So, in a family environment, it may be that this is a grandfather that we all respect. How am I going to set limits? How am I going to say no to this elderly person? But part of me wants to say no. The other part of me is like, but he's the grandfather, or the elderly grandmother that we all respect. So it can be difficult because we see them as having more power, more influence within the family structure. Or in a work environment, it could be, setting limits with a coworker may be much easier, of course, than setting limits with a boss and asking a boss what you need and saying no to a boss. Or in a romantic relationship, if it's an abusive relationship, by definition, an abusive relationship, one partner has more power than the other and puts fear into the other partner. And so, of course, it's difficult and sometimes very unsafe to set limits with an abusive partner. So these are the situations. And, you just mentioned doctors and healthcare providers. If we see them as having power over us, then it's harder to set limits or to ask for what you need. But if we see them as equal, if we see them as we're a team, we're working on this together, then we're more empowered to bring up what we need and what we think, what we envision for our treatment. It's easier to be vocal if we see them as equal to us.
To kind of equalize things. So in some ways, kind of seeing them as human and as part of a collaborative relationship and you contributing just as much to the relationship as they do.
Exactly.
I really think that's lovely. And, another thing that I also encourage sometimes people to do when they're interacting in medical situations is to maybe bring a partner or bring a trusted individual to help also advocate, just as a little reminder, maybe as a kind of a transition to being able to, 'cause it's a learned skill, right? Like setting boundaries and honoring boundaries is a skill, especially when you're not kind of taught and hasn't been modeled for you. And
exactly. And, in the past, I don't do it as often, but in the past, I was so worried that I wanted to hold myself accountable when I went to visit a doctor for whatever the issue, that I would make sure that I write it down, that it's right in front of me, that I don't forget. I want to ask about this thing, or I want to ask for this, or I want to make sure that I bring this up because otherwise I would forget. And that also can be very empowering, in my opinion. And then next to that, as you said, having a partner, a friend, family member with us, that can also bring that emotional support that we need.
Absolutely. So I'm curious, how do you think people can start to notice when a boundary needs to be set? And I feel like maybe you touched on that a little bit earlier when you mentioned resentment as a clue, but I'm curious, what else would you say for like somebody needs to pay attention to that's, saying, hey, I need to set a boundary here?
Yes, resentment, definitely. Also, if you kind of feel drained around a person, if you feel anxious around them, like start paying attention what's causing this anxiety for me. It may be boundaries, it may be something else, but just pay attention to the anxious feelings that come up. If you are very okay or even happy when they cancel on you and you're like, oh, okay, good, you're not, you welcome that. And so these are some signs that there may be a lack of balance in the relationship in terms of your needs being expressed, or if you experience them as being pushy. And because if you wait on setting the boundaries, setting your boundaries with them and setting limits with them, they get pushier and pushier. Because, this is what I didn't mention earlier. With boundaries, we teach people how to treat us.
Yes.
We teach them how to treat us. So if we keep allowing them to be pushy, so they learn that it's okay. And we know that it's not. So
right. Well, and yeah, people kind of learn based on what we model and, how we interact. And I think what you said in terms of being aware, it's like a lot of physical symptoms can give us clues that we need to pay attention to. And I think about Black women or just other cultures and also people who've just been systematically, disenfranchised from their kind of lived experience. It can be hard to really connect or trust what one is feeling physically. And so it makes me, kind of curious about what role do you think, kind of trauma or lived experience plays in how someone may or may not feel safe in setting those boundaries? Because I feel like my brain is pinging all over the place thinking about, this other layer of context that I think makes it really challenging for people.
Of course, yes. When there's history of trauma, we can go all the way to pre-verbal, being a baby. A baby's brain is developed in relation to the caregiver. So if the mom, grandma, foster mom, whoever's the main caregiver, if they attend to the child's needs, when the child cries, certain hormones are produced in the body, in the brain, and they help shape the brain a certain way. If the child's needs are not paid attention to, then the brain develops in a different way. So our brain is very much shaped by how we are connected or not to our caregiver, our primary caregiver. So let's say there's a mom that's very depressed and is not able to be present for the child. So this child is crying for food or to be changed or to be held. And if that child is not being attended to, the child learns that my needs are not very important. And especially if the mom gets angry, then it's an extra layer of, I'm not going to express my needs. So that can be how our brain is set up through our childhood experience. Now, the same is true for an adult experience. Let's say we're talking about an abusive relationship. And many times people end up in a narcissistic type relationship where they didn't have that history. They had a relatively healthy childhood, but they still end up in a toxic relationship because, again, the manipulation and the games are just something, let's say, that they're not aware of. So it's very easy for all sorts of women, whether with history of abuse or not, to end up in a relationship with a toxic, narcissistic person. So in that relationship also, if a woman or a partner, man, whomever, however you identify, the gender doesn't matter, the person is learning that if I express my needs, I'm going to be put down. I'm going to get yelled at. I'm going to be told you don't even know what you're talking about, what need, invalidated. So because I'm going to be rejected. So because of all the outcomes, I learned then not to express my needs. Then eventually self-neglect becomes a protective factor.
Right.
I want to protect myself from rejection and being put down and getting yelled at, so I don't take care of my needs.
Right. It becomes a very learned behavior early on. And so I'm curious, how do you personally navigate the tension between being compassionate and holding firm boundaries, especially if these are some of the early messages and you're, still kind of learning and supporting people who are maybe new to learning or maybe need a refresher in learning how to, in terms of reinforcing or how they set those boundaries. So how do you personally navigate that tension?
I think for me, and I would recommend for anyone who has difficulty setting boundaries, because especially if it's not something that you normally do, is to start with compassion toward yourself. To recognize that, yes, this is difficult. Yes, this takes courage. This is not easy. This is not something I do every day. I'm new at this thing. So a lot of compassion and sitting with that discomfort for a little bit and getting to know it, getting to, validate that discomfort because it's real and it makes sense. We don't want to just say, okay, just be brave, just go for it, and push ourselves into the situation. We don't want to do that. So first is to have compassion and patience with the self. And also, if it applies, obviously I'm not talking about an abusive relationship, but if it applies, practicing compassion for the other person as well. Because sometimes they don't know, because if they don't know my needs and they're asking for a certain thing over and over again, I have taught them that it's okay to ask for this thing over and over again. I haven't told them, for example, I haven't taught them that I don't like to get phone calls after 10 p.m. That's what they keep calling me after 10 p.m. It's not that they try to take advantage of me. It's just that they don't know. They assume because it's a convenient time for them, that it's a convenient time for me. So the next step really is to have compassion for the other person and just pause for a moment. Are they doing this to be manipulative or to be pushy, to take advantage of me? Or maybe not. Maybe they're doing this just because they don't know. And so we have less. In that way, we have less of an anger or resentment toward them because we're taking responsibility for, I haven't really shared my feelings about this, or how they cannot read my mind.
Yeah, no, I love that. I love that. And, I think the piece around self-compassion is so important and sometimes the hardest skill for people to learn and appreciate. And, especially when they're maybe wanting a very clear and fast result, and it's they kind of in the cycle of just really being self-critical and and angry or frustrated with themselves. And reminded me of this book too called The Mindful Path to Self-Compassion by Dr. Kristen. And so just really leaning into and supporting people and leaning into the discomfort, because sometimes that discomfort is validation that you're working in the area that you need to be working in too.
Yes.
I love that as maybe a gentle way to start recognizing and starting to, set boundaries when people might need to.
Yes. And, and a reminder again that it's about being respectful to me and being respectful to the other person. We're not going to be mean. We're not going to be rude. We're not going to be harsh, because those are all aggressive ways. We do not want any of that. We're going to go into the conversation with kindness, and that can help kind of push us a little forward with the decision.
Yeah.
Also, whether or not, we're talking in a situation where the person has more power than us, or if we're equal in power, regardless, if the subject is minor or big, regardless of all of that, I think it's always, always important to prepare for a conversation before you go in, meaning prepare yourself for the best case scenario, for the worst case scenario, in either scenario, or middle of the way scenario. In any of these situations, what would I feel? What would I do? What would I think? Just so that you're not caught off guard. You want to be prepared for possible outcomes. You don't just want to go in and say something, have a very sensitive conversation without being aware of potential consequences. A consequence can be very small, like you get a lecture from the person. It can be really big, where they don't talk to you anymore. They kick you out of their life. Or obviously in an abusive situation, it can be a safety issue with a boss. It may be that you're not going to get that raise or promotion that you were looking forward to. So, but again, it could be a conversation with a best friend. You still want to be aware that maybe the least I will experience is awkward, and I want to be prepared for that.
No, definitely in that preparation. And I've heard you talk a lot about kindness and respectfulness as part of just thinking about how we set boundaries, how we, engage with people. And also, I think just how I know you and how I've grown to know and appreciate the Iranian culture, and how kindness is, I feel like, a very huge part of your culture. And I'm curious, when you talk about teaching from kind of a Western lens, it makes me wonder, where is the Iranian lens for you in this? And I'm just wondering, any final words about that for our audience?
Yeah, so Okay, I have, obviously, as we mentioned, I have my Persian culture, I have the mainstream culture, and I teach people from the mainstream culture. I teach my clients, my students, online. It's all about that. But of course, there's a cultural piece. And so I think for each person, I would recommend that you figure out for yourself, okay, what is the mainstream culture teaching me? And then be very aware, what is my culture teaching me? So just have the awareness that they're very different. And then refer to your heart. Just get quiet with your heart. Where does my heart want me to go? Closer to this side or closer to that side or somewhere in the middle? Where does my heart want to go? And then make the decision according to where feels good and right to your heart. And so it's a very personal decision. And whatever you decide, then you're aware that there's a price that I pay. On the one side, it may be that I'm letting go of my need. On the other side, it may be that I'm letting go of a family member who I'm never going to see again because I know when I say no to them, I'm gone from their life, So you decide for yourself what is the price that you're willing to pay. So it's very, very personal. It's not something that I can advise people on, just so that you need to really become aware of the differences and go back to your own heart and see what prices you are willing to pay. And so based on that, you would decide for yourself, what does my heart say? Do I want to make a decision that goes more toward my culture or goes more toward my own individual needs, which is more in alignment with the mainstream teaching? And you decide for yourself which feels right, which feels true to my heart, and be prepared that either way, there's something that is going to be the price of this decision. On the one side, it could be the price of letting go of your need and not taking care of it. On the other side, it could be that you have to say goodbye to a family member or a couple of family members because you just set limits that is not appropriate within your culture. So either way, just be prepared for giving up on something.
Yeah.
We have to decide for ourselves, what do I want to give up on?
Yeah. And maybe not necessarily giving up on something, but really giving to oneself at the same time.
Absolutely. So absolutely. That's the main goal. Again, the goal is to be as authentic as possible. And that's what we're going to gain. And, having the awareness that there's a price to pay for it.
Yeah,
there is
absolutely.
a price. There is a price to pay for it. And I've paid that price. So I'm very familiar, unfortunately, with the subject. Yes.
Yeah. So I just want to also honor and just think about, let me just start that over again. Now, I really appreciate you sharing that. And like living one's authentic self is so easy to say and yet so hard to do and actualize. And yet we continue to try and work toward that. And so I'm just a little curious, any last words for our audience?
Yeah, last words is really just, again, emphasizing that awareness of our true self. You can call it, again, the essence inside of all of us, or you can call it the divine inside of you. Whatever feels true to you, you can call it that. That has always been inside of you and will be inside of you. That part of you has never left. The part of you that feels worthy, that feels confident, that feels calm is always inside of you, has never gone anywhere. It's just that it's hiding underneath all the other stuff like guilt and shame and trauma and all that. So really, the work is to get to know the parts that are getting in the way and then eventually get to connect with that part of you, the true self, more often than not, because that's where all the answers are.
Yeah, I really love that. And it's like really appreciating how, when we peel back some of those layers, how powerful it is to connect with what's at our core and really relearn things that learn things that we didn't know we needed or relearn things that we've forgotten. And so I just also want to, ask you one last thing. Where are you putting out into the world and where can people find you?
Yes, thank you. I'm on Instagram almost every day, so please feel free to come by and visit me on Instagram, Power to the Self. And when you search it, put dots in between the words, so Power to the Self with dots in between the words. And my website is powertotheself.com. And I also have a free resource that I would like to make sure that everybody takes advantage of it. It's a two-parter. So one part is a secret podcast. It's called How to Say No Without Guilt. And it's an 80-minute podcast that I have cut down into small pieces just so that you can find each piece easily. If you want to listen to it again, you don't have to go through a whole 80 minutes. And you will learn how to this is mainly for relationships that you want to save and you want to work on. And then there's this other part of the resource that's for situations where you're ready to say goodbye to somebody and you don't know how to say goodbye to them. You don't know how to end things with them. I have come up with a script for every possible situation that I could think of. Mm-hmm. And so use the script as your guide. You don't have to say the exact same thing. You can edit it. And I invite you to edit it to the version that feels true to you. And we have ones for ending a relationship, let's say with a date that's not working out, or with a best friend, or no longer they're your best friend. They used to be your best friend, but they're not anymore, or somebody at work. So I have different scenarios, and you can just go through them and see which one can be of benefit to you. And Dr. Loree will have the link for that.
Thank you. Thank you. And I just want to thank you so much for being here. And I think this is a powerful reminder that boundaries are more than rules or limits. They're really acts of self-respect and self-compassion and self-preservation. And they show up in our relationships, and they help us kind of show up with authenticity, that, like you mentioned, Homeyra, and not with resentment. So if this conversation stirs something in you, maybe you had a realization, a memory, or even some discomfort, I really want to invite you to sit with that and what boundaries might need tending to in your life right now. So thank you for listening to The Layers We Live. And if this episode resonated with you, I want you to consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you haven't already, subscribe and leave a review, because it really helps others find this space and helps me keep creating these layered conversations for you. And for more reflections, resources, or to learn about my work, visit the link in the show notes. And remember, your story matters. Your healing is yours to define, and you are not alone in the layers you carry. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Dr. Loree, for inviting me. It was wonderful to be here, and I trust that your audience will benefit from this conversation. Thanks again.
Thank you. And I know they will definitely get something out of this. I know that I did, and I always enjoy our conversations and come away a lot more grounded. And so thank you for that. And on that note, I'm Dr. Loree Johnson. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you all next time.